Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 389th New Social Environment. I'm Anya Bernstein, an events assistant at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with Erik Lindman, Louis Bloch, and Tom McGlynn. We're thrilled to have the Rail's own Elizabeth Lothian here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. We've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are all Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, to borrow from the brilliant Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living source for resources. And I'm just going to post that in the chat right now. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Erik Lindman lives and works in New York. He earned his BA from Columbia College, Columbia University in 2007, and received a Yale Norfolk Painting Fellowship in 2006. Lindman was honored at the Hirshhorn Museum's Artist Gala in 2019. He has also received the Sudler Prize for Excellence in the Arts from Columbia University and an Ellen B. Stoeckel Fellowship for Yale Norfolk School of Art. His work has been included in exhibitions at the Kunsthalle in Freiburg, Switzerland, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, White Columns in New York, and the 109 in Nice, France, among others. Louis Bloch is a Brooklyn-based painter and writer. His writing has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Hyperallergic, and Fobly Journal, and his work has been shown in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Venice. And Tom McGlynn is an artist, writer, and independent curator based in New York City. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian. He is the director of Beautiful Fields, an organization dedicated to socially engaged curatorial projects, and is also currently a visiting lecturer at Parsons School of Design, the New School. Tom is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks, Anya. And Erik, thanks for being here today with us.
Thank you.
And you're tuning in from your studio.
Yeah.
It'll be nice to see the paintings in progress behind you as we talk. I'll pull up the slides right now. So this is the current show in Paris at Almine Rec, up right now. And I wanted to start with this painting, which is, you've made this year, right, Erik?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It immediately made me think of this Picasso in the Met, partially because of the form, partially because of the colors. And you're using this new technique, or this technique that you've been developing, of having an underlayer of this epoxy substance that you're then printing a sort of texture pattern on through various methods. And I love the idea of that in conversation with this pattern that Picasso painted on the Harlequin's clothes, partially because there is this flatness in most of the figure, but then you can see in the right arm that flatness sort of regains volume a little bit, and the checkered pattern starts to describe form again. So I wondered if you could talk about this import of pattern into the work, the decorative, and this new technique that you're using.
Well, so just to give a bit of framework, is the material is like the epoxy resin putty is almost like clay when it's curing. So it's like two parts of this hardener and this like filled resin. And it's like this gray color, it looks almost like gum. And you mix it together with your hands and wear gloves if you want to be safe. And it has about an hour time before it starts to cure, and it gets hot and it's soft. And what I'm doing with the material is creating an impression on a textured surface. So I'm pressing it into, in this case, there are these almost like bar mats. So there are these textured tiles that you use in a bar to have your pint glasses dry on. But it's really just something with spikes on it, right? And when the putty is pulled away from the material, it's distorted, the shape gets distorted, as well as the matrix of that, even the dots from the mat. So this shape, or the pattern inside of the central form here has like a slight curve to it that's turning, which is the result of that pulling away. And so this is the first like the beginning of the painting is like taking this, once the epoxy cures overnight, right? I'm taking that and I'm adhering it to a wood panel, like usually right in the center in a way, and then this begins to be painted over and around this epoxy form, which is a very similar way of working with found surfaces and objects that I've used in the past. And so it's interesting to me because I think the relationship to the Harlequin painting, I mean, is on one hand, it's this form looks painted, it looks printed in a way, and has a quality of almost like the painting itself could even have been a printing plate or a machine or something for making another image in a way, right? And also in this way, like the painted element is happening on top of the surface, on top of the form. And I think with that Harlequin painting of Picasso's painting, it's very interesting to me to think about like it's a painting of a painted person wearing a painting in a way. Like that pattern is on top of the form. Like the person is almost the epoxy resin in a sense, right? That's getting painted in and around. He or they are the image carrier in a sense, in the same way that this resin is acting as an image carrier for my work in this current cycle that I'm working with.
And in person, the texture on this painting is fairly unusually thick and overworked for Picasso. And you can see that there are a lot of changes in the underlying image that were made before arriving at this place where the pattern could be painted relatively flat on top of that.
And it's kind of interesting because I think, I think of I mean, that's like curving of the arm that you notice, Louis, is like also just reinforced in that slight curving of the epoxy resin in that work that I'm making. And I mean, I think also, just to be clear, like the reference in my title is coming after my work was completed. Like my work was not made exactly in direct reference to the Picasso work, but it did come up when I was kind of after I was looking at through the images of a lot of my work and reflecting on this. That bracketed title came to mind. Like the Harlequin reference just seemed very fitting to this painting. Like primarily to me, it was the colors of the blue and the red, which seemed very much. It's like ingrained in my mind in a way, like to this reference in a way of like this sort of. I mean, I think of it as like a performative self-portrait in a way, of kind of the painter, right?
It's interesting to me, Eric, you know, when we talked in your studio on Saturday, how you know, we talked about this relationship between abstraction and the found object, and it occurs to me in this conversation that Picasso might have chosen the Harlequin not just as subject matter, but also like as object matter. You know, there's something about Harlequin's outfit that kind of camouflages them.
Mm-hmm.
It camouflages them as a figure. So then they become this symbolic figure. And I do think that there's a relationship in your work, not necessarily directly, you know, to this Picasso, but in that sense of like how you come across found objects and then they become camouflaged within your paintings as paintings.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think that, I mean, I'm even just looking at this painting right now when we're talking, and I'm thinking of, I mean, Picasso's work. It's like a cipher to have something to paint in a way, right? Even if you look at the background, it's like painted wallpaper. It's an image of an image in a way, right? And I think in a way, like a lot of my found surfaces and things that I've been is all the engagement with them is all just like about how to find a beginning, how to start, how to anchor my engagement with painting somewhere in the world, and then it goes and it very, very quickly goes somewhere else in the process of working. And the way that like the paint is is going in and around that object in a way.
Yeah, I found this great quote. I think that relates to what you're talking about from Wallace Stevens, and it's from a poem that took the place of a mountain. And he's in this excerpt, he says, "The exact rock where his inexactness would discover at last a view towards that which they had edged." So I understand what you're saying in sense of like finding an edge in a way to start. Right?
Yeah.
I love that quote because it's just so beautifully encapsulates something that's kind of very hard to express. You know, it's like, but finding that edge, and also finding it, not necessarily inventing it, but like finding the edge.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think in that way too. It's just nice for I like imagining Picasso encountering these harlequins, which were kind of as almost the way that I would encounter a found surface. I mean, at least from what I understand, like I've been kind of on a John Richardson kick in the last year, the pandemic, and I mean, from what I understand, it's like the harlequin was like a bit of like outre mode of entertainment that he would kind of, I could imagine Picasso encountering on the streets in a way. I mean, not necessarily seeking out. I mean, I know he did enjoy going to the circus and whatnot, but I mean, seeing, it's almost like an antiquated form inside of that you kind of are coming across in a way that already has like a visual history and a syntax inside of it that he's kind of almost appropriating here for his own, like a own way to drape like his own painting onto in a way.
Right, like it might have been something he saw on the way to the studio or something, you know, or like he
found it, and it's like very much in the same way that I've encountered these found surfaces. Like I've never I have not gone out to a scrapyard with a truck. I have and done like a haul. I'm not using any sort of, it's like I'm not seeking it in a sense. It's like
Right.
these forms.
And I think the fact that the fact that the epoxy forms are made outside of the canvas before being applied adds to that. Even though they're not found, they're made in your studio. That adds to the foundness or the found quality that it can then be painted onto the surface or pasted onto the surface.
And I think that's something that's interesting in this body of work that in the Balka show that's like transitional in a, or has landed, I think, through a lot of research, is that like that pulling and that tearing of the surf of the putty. It's interesting to me that it still has the same sort of facture to me as the found object, and then in a way too, it makes it like not about the history of the object. It makes it less about the narrative around the object. It makes it almost much more about just finding an edge in the way of like Tom was talking about in that sense.
This was the first time that I had seen Balka's name. This was your show a few years ago that we did a print interview in the rail for. Do you want to talk about Peter Balka, how you encountered him, the framing of the show?
Sure. I mean, for me, yeah, we're getting right into it in this way of thinking about when I was this painting is part of like the result of exploring making paintings that actually did not have, say, something that seemed found and picked up from the street directly, but I was interested in trying to maintain both like a physical objective correlative as well as like a very expansive associative image process, which, I mean, I'll just go, and so we'll put that aside. I mean, what was going on is like I took a trip to interview the painter John Zurier, who has a show up right now at Peter Blum, and this was for the last show that he had, which was 2 years ago, and it feels like last week in a certain way. I went over to see John in Iceland to do an interview for the rail, and it was like a very amazing, the experience of the landscape was very formative to me, because it made me question a lot of what we think of in terms of being natural or not. I grew up in New York. I spent my whole life here pretty much, just my big geographic move was on the M79 from York Avenue to Broadway. And I, at a certain sense too, though, I feel like very, very, very much interested in landscape, right? But I think also in a certain way, my vision has been informed, I guess, by this urban landscape, but I feel like it's a very melodramatic to talk about like the urban landscape in a sense now too. So, but I was here in Iceland and looking at these these vistas. Everything is very, very, seemingly very dramatic and almost unnatural in a way, how vibrant these colors are, and sort of like a subtle iridescence of the earth, and there's a really, really stark there's no trees, and then there's these big glacial cutouts through the earth. So the way that you see mountains coming, it almost looks like a ramp, like that Steinberg's like rampant gisant on the Cézanne. Like it just like, but like in reality, like it's just like the mountain is just there, and all I could think about were these images that I'd seen of Peter Balke's work years ago. Which is he's a Norwegian painter who I had very, very little knowledge of. A friend who was working at Simon Dickinson Gallery they had done a show in 2015 called Masters of Modernism, which was a 3-artist show of Edvard Munch, Per Kirkeby, and Peter Balke. And she brought over this book, and I looked through it, and I'd heard of Kirkeby and Munch. I love Kirkeby's work. Munch, I love a lot of his work, and I hate a lot of it, but I think is a really fascinating artist. I'd never heard of this guy, Peter Balke. I opened up the book, and I'm going through it, and I couldn't make any sense of it. I mean, some of the work looked like Bob Ross, like on like a really bad acid trip, like a really dark trip, like that Bob Ross paint, and then some of it looked oddly like Chinese, like a very interesting experience of space that I'd only really seen in a lot of Chinese painting, historical Chinese painting. And it seemed very strangely painted, unusually painted for this time. And so, you know, so I started to kind of try to learn a little bit more about this artist. And I think this painting that's on the screen is a really strong example of works that I'm very drawn to, actually, that Balke is making. I wouldn't say this is necessarily of the Bob Ross ilk, but I mean, this almost looks Tolkien-esque if you're looking at it, could, like right away, like this is the cover of, you know, one of the Lord of the Rings books. I mean, but then there's something of how the facture of the surface, which is really actually very, very interesting to me. He's you know, these white lines are made with looks like a knife or something, palette knife or some other implement, not a brush, that's sort of pulling away and revealing pulling the pigment away from the surface and allowing the white ground to shine through and create this image. And you know, same with the ocean and these rocks. He's creating textures using non-traditional painting materials. And Balke was, the more it was trained, when he came from a very poor family, farmers. This is when Norway was just sort of emerging as a modern state. There was no state art school. Balke kind of came under the wing of like a local family that was a bit more well off. He actually adopted that name from them. That's like a new identity he took on. He took on their surname, Balke, and learned a lot of decorative painting techniques. And he used these decorative painting techniques later when he started to make fine art. And the more I think Balke had traveled through Europe to France and to Germany to try to. There wasn't much of an art scene in Christiania, which contemporary Oslo. He had uneven success early on, and I think ended up, you know, he was sort of rejected for his unusual technique, in a sense. And I think so I mean, Balke is like a figure, I think, became for me in my art practice in a way. He it's almost like a dedication towards this. I think there's a certain honesty in a sense in his use of what's at hand to and he's also creating something that I think it really predates a lot of recognition of surface and artifice in painting. I think he understood it almost seems like he was working. They're almost like they're almost like abstract expression. They're very ahead of this, what we think of in terms of modernism in a way, and of recognizing sort of the obvious fictive nature of visuality. And in a way, I think like a work like this that's on the screen is really intriguing to me. You could see almost on the lower right hand portion of in the center, it almost looks like a thumbprint. A lot of these smaller works that he was making towards the end of his life, where he had by that time couldn't sell any of these big works or commissions to royalty. In his height, he had sold a number of works to King Louis Philippe in France, and you can see there's some that are in the Louvre. These works at the end of his life are almost small works on paper that he was trying to make to sell to the new middle class that had developed, and they're made with fingerprints in his hands in a way. And there you have like this pull of the light and creating light. And I think we could see this as sort of, on one hand, they seem full of melodrama, and then when you go around Iceland, I mean, it actually looks like this. That's what's so fascinating to me. Whatever, and going back for me to the original question of how this started to happen in my work, I think in a certain way there was the tension in painting that I'm interested in between this like image, reference, object, and figure. It's like all kind of coming together here in Volke's work. And for me also, like that painting of mine that you showed, I see a landscape or a space in there. It's like almost a evening look, or like this discordant light that's coming through the work, through the center, that has an interiority. It's also kind of recognizing its paintedness and painted quality. And when I'm going and looking at some of these Balke works, they still, I see there's just a very odd compositional trope that he's using of this moon, and this right in the center of the painting, and this sort of bluff of this northern cape that's coming up in his paintings again and again. Right there it is. And I see that. I saw that in this painting of mine. And it allowed me to kind of to leave this in my work in a way. I feel like previously I had such a very strong inclination to sort of sanitize any exterior space that might be coming in. I mean, I think so when you see this painting, I'm not saying that it feels clearly depictive of a landscape or anything like that, but I wouldn't say that the kind of parallelisms to that association in the same way that black and white Balke small drawing we were looking at. I mean, those are just clearly marks and scrapes in the back too, but then they're also more than that at the same time.
It's interesting. I remember when you mentioned the connection to decorative painting, and I mentioned Braque's family, George Braque, family having that same connection to a tradition, the craft tradition of faux marbre, faux bois, and how he incorporated that into his synthetic cubism. And he incorporated that, you know, with faux bois, there's kind of a tour de force of like illusionism, right? There's this tour de force of expressionistic illusionism if you look really close, but when you stand back, it reads as wood. And you know, that paradoxical structure in cubism that Braque was trying to set up in terms of this is a picture of a picture, and this is a picture of you looking at a picture, you know, like those levels of edges, right? It becomes like a palimpsest, a game that the artist holds out. I mean, it seems like Balke, though, however, is just kind of using it as an expressive technique. But it's interesting because it does have that exposing of kind of technique, you know, like foregrounding of technique, which is very kind of early for that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think it just it dovetailed with a lot of I mean, you know, my dad's Swedish and he lives in Sweden, and he has a friend who older guy named Arne who we'd go and visit. And Arne is like, he is trained as a, you know, craft painter, and it's amazing. We were like looking, he had to join, I don't think they had these guilds anymore, but essentially it seemed like the same kind of process. Is like, to get your certification, you had to show these examples that you're able to make this kind of marble, this kind of wood, and he had this portfolio that he made in his youth of just like as page after page of this differently executed forms. And I just was looking at it, and I really found it like there's a quality of just enoughness to it that I think is very, I find it is often exciting in paintings that I see. Like there's still enough breath in it. Like it's not overworked. Like it, but it's like, because also, I mean, they have you know, they're on the clock. They're trying to get their job done. You know, like so they need to satisfy like enough of the clients. Like, oh, this looks like wood, and then this is okay, but we're not going crazy, like spending too much time on this. And it's transformative of an object, but it's still, you know, it's clearly not marble.
Right.
I mean, when you look at it, it's very, and you know, it's just it's these interesting forms too of like kind of where painting and paint lies in culture,
Right.
in a sense too.
Right.
You know, paint, it's and I think there's a lot of equivalency, I think, in a certain way between perhaps where Balke is coming from and where this impetus, you know, where my dad's from, of where he's from this area in Dalarna, which is like the most Swedish place. It's like where the Swedes go to feel Swedish. And you know, it's full of these places of these, there are these estates that these farmers had when the farmers became like got a little money. This is like in the late 1800s. They wanted to show off, and so, but you know, they didn't have any of this fancy material, so like everything is painted to look like something else. Brick was really hard to come by, but that was really fancy to have a brick house. So they would make it look, they would build these painted facades on the front of their house to make their house look like it had an extra story from the road, and it's faux brick. And they're really just these bizarre kind of sculptures in a way in the end.
It sounds like
And,
your description of the backdrops of the landscape in Iceland, actually. It sounds exactly the same.
yeah.
There's an aspect
yeah.
of the uncanny. There's an aspect of the uncanny to it.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe that's, I mean, maybe that's what's the strangeness in Balka's paintings. I mean, I can't really figure out what it is in them. Like they're not what feels very haunting in them in a way to me.
A lot of the writing refers to the techniques with the rags and the palette knife as a trick or tricks.
Yeah.
But you use the phrase direct efficiency to talk about it in one of your pieces of writing, which I really liked. Especially in regards to the materials, like you were saying, that are at hand, or the situation that you find yourself in to make the expression of what you're trying to make, which is interesting to think about in terms of the painting materials that you're using, which are acrylic sometimes, or sometimes things from the street, or sometimes very specialized putties and epoxies that you get from a specialty sculpture store.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's I think I have it's shifting a little bit, but that's why I'm hesitant. Like I find it very interesting. Like I started the first paintings that I started to make that I found that were mine, felt that they're using found surfaces, okay, for something like that had a marks, that a certain gesture or shape that I was using to adhere to a painting and begin on. So this painting is a great example like that. It had these pieces of found wood that I arranged pretty directly onto this panel and glued, and in the process of like gluing the wood with using an acrylic medium, there's other residual elements that or marks that happened and accrued, and those ended up, those other marks ended up being painted black, as well as the found wood in a painting like this. And I am, it's interesting because at the same, how do I say this? It's like, I think there's something in painting that engages with like the tradition, with the traditional in a way, which would seem kind of, to me at least, paradoxical with using like magic sculpt, like this material that's often used by hobbyists, or seems kind of, or something that's used in film production, or something that seems very novel in a way, or contemporary. But at this, I mean, so I'm just saying, like, I think if you think about it, the idea of I think for me, using these different materials that are at hand seems actually, to me, the most direct way to engage with what that, to open up and that idea of what this tradition means to me. And I think there's something that when I really think of tradition, I think about the idea of this is something that engages in a certain visual space that has a limit and a frame around it, that is, anything you put inside of it is becoming an image and interesting in a way. So it actually, to me, it doesn't have to do so much in the end with it having to be oil on linen or something in this way. Even though I could use those materials in a sense, it's in a way like using and exploring this epoxy resin putty is really just practical in a sense too. It's like this works very well to get to the point, and and in the end, I think it's a successful painting when you're not really thinking about how it's made. Like in the end, I don't really care. I don't look at the Baltica painting and think about him using a palette knife. I don't think of him using a balled up cloth in this way. I'm having an experience that's like ancillary to the fabrication of the work in a way. But I think his use of, or painting that I'm interested in that's using material, there is a directness of it that I like, that allows for light and space to happen inside of this kind of space that's historical in a way.
I like this
And in
idea.
your-
Go ahead. I
Oh,
was
no,
just-
you go ahead, Tom.
I was going to respond to what Erik was saying about tradition. And I find it really fascinating that you're talking about tradition without influence in a way, because you're saying you're not really thinking about Balka's, palette knives or anything. So, I think sometimes that idea of tradition can be, typically it's like, well, it's old, But it sounds like you're talking about the idea of a tradition in a much larger sense, and also not necessarily shackled to like what Bloom would call the anxiety of influence,
Yeah.
Which is, I think that's a really interesting way to think about tradition.
It's a bit, I'm still, it's challenging to talk about too. I mean, because I think we think it's but I think that I think that's actually just like where the meaning comes from in the work too, if there is any in that sense, like of like where, because the meaning is not of a context. Like I'm not looking, and in that way too, it's like I am not looking to Balka's work to because I really want to have a document of the North Sea or something, you know what I mean?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, of course, I guess it sounded more obvious. But I mean, I feel like like when I'm thinking of tradition, it's not in a limiting sense. It's in an expansive way,
right?
And of it on one hand is actually recognizing the limits of painting in order to go in to engage with something larger, instead of I see it as like on a parallel course of something that is coming at it ironic through an ironic perspective, or something that is almost nihilistic in this way. I think which is interesting, because with Balka's work, there's something that could almost seem has to be ironic, because it is almost kitsch in some of the work.
Do you think that something could be structurally ironic and not like figuratively ironic? I mean, like the decorative painting. The decorative painting is kind of structurally ironic, but it's not like meant to be figuratively ironic. Do you know what I mean? Because it presents this thing that's its opposite. It's presenting something in kind of an insincere way, but just in terms of like the structure of the image, and not in terms of like the meaning of that. Like you don't look at a faux bois d'or and say, "Oh, that's funny. That's totally ironic," or that's making a comment on culture that's insincere.
I think immediately Joe Zucker's 100-foot painting, when you're saying structural irony, Tom. I don't know if that's a good reference to use, but
yeah, no, I think that's really good reference. I think these are other definitions that people kind of use in generalized ways, like tradition and irony, which I mean, you can use them in expansive ways too. So like Erik is doing.
Well, when you were talking about the Tom, like so you know, so the painter that comes to mind with that is like Simone Antai, which I think is very interesting to me. So Simone, so the moin, or like the folded up canvases. I mean, that process is actually exactly. Maybe if Balkan like looked at his hand and the palette, the rag after he made this and stretched that up. I mean, that's the Antai painting 100 years later. I don't think you look at an Antai painting and think of it as ironic. And I think this is very interesting though, because if you look like Antai's earlier work is like this surrealist infected painting that is almost is using a lot of the same tricks that Balk is using, of the exposed ground, of the shallow space that actually feels very deep. And I think there's like an interesting line there, because of what feels exciting to me in a certain way about Antai's painting is the same amount of energy and image expressed as the decorative, as Arne up in Rättvik next to my dad, who's making the faux bois paneling in the bathroom.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Erik, we'd been talking about the picture space, or the stretched object panel canvas, sort of being this transformative rectangle that makes materials into a different thing, makes them alchemical just by virtue of being applied in this rectangular square. And I wanted to ask about these two devices that you're using now. One is the aluminum siding on these types of panels, and then the other, which is sort of you developed this in a former series, but these canvas webbing with herringbone pattern, and they sort of frame or bracket or suggest an extension even of the whatever the picture space is that these forms are floating on. I know these came before the aluminum, I believe. Can you talk about those, the development of that, how you're thinking about them in working in the space of the painting, or with or against those forms in the center?
Well, I mean, in a certain way, it's like how it started was I was making a big painting. It's that painting Pisces that was in the show of Peter Blum. It's a big square painting. It's like about 90 by 86, and I was you know, the paintings are made in a kind of an open-ended way, and some of them they all have a very different, like the material, it feels new and approached it differently through each work, even though a lot of them are engaged with collage from the beginning. But like when I'm working on using the collage and creating these edges, a lot of times the edges kind of are becoming an impediment to the image that is being created in the work. And so with a painting, as opposed to a physical sculpture, you can't, I mean, you have, there's just like a physics of that low relief where it either has to be obscured or you know, addressed in a certain way. So I had a big piece of canvas that was cut out in the shape, and all of a sudden it looked like some weird thing from Star Wars on the right side of the painting, of just, no, Star Trek. It was this weird shape that looked like some battleship, and I hated it so much, and I wanted to get it out of the painting. So the best way I thought of doing it was to put something on top of it and work around it so you wouldn't see that shape anymore. And I had these pieces of canvas webbing, which I had used for making handles on the back of panels, or it's like the strapping that you'd use when you're making a travel frame or a crate for a really big painting. So I took it and I glued it with the acrylic medium over that weird Star Wars Trek shape, and I just like put a bar over it, you know. So then like you couldn't see, you wouldn't see that shape behind it. And when I put that webbing on it, I loved the heavy weave of that strapping and that webbing, because when you dragged a brush over it, like it created a matrix, like a very high relief matrix of it looked almost printed, the bar and that the band. So it's funny. I mean, you have that pre-Cubist Picasso. I mean, essentially, it's the same function of the idea of a repoussoir, like that they're using in painting, to something to put put on the surface that actually makes that declares it acknowledges the artifice and the surface of the painting, and at the same time strangely creates a really deep space inside of the painting. And I'm using this banding as ways of kind of bracketing this central figure or form in these works. So some of these have now, I've been talking about that I liked the way that when a brush would drag or over the band, it would it would look printed. And so I've actually just started using commercially printed bands that have a black stripe in the middle or a red stripe or multiple stripes. And that's what you're seeing in these paintings here that are a bit smaller than the ones with the aluminum bars. And it's interesting because the aluminum bars are these, it's angle from Home Depot, essentially. It's the most utilitarian, basic, it's a very basic building material, I think, when I see it. I think of, you know, I talked about it with a friend as like landlord construction. I mean, it's things that you'd put on the corner of the drywall in the lobby so the suitcases don't mess up the wall. And at the same time, it also looks strangely like fancy. Like it looks like something that like the magpie would be attracted to and want to steal, or a raccoon. Like you want to hold on to it, and for me, when I'm using this with painting in a way, like it is it's acknowledging the objecthood of this painting, and also putting it into a dialogue where it almost feels like an icon, or like a, and these are on these wood panels, and now we have this aluminum on the sides that is framing the work, and it's made, it also kind of holds the painting as opposed to the frame kind of protecting the painting. Like this seems like it could kind of be like protecting the edge in a sense, but they're rather direct. And you see all those paintings, there's like a kind of a real taste trope for a while of like abstract paintings having these konkel style frames on them, which are those polished, welded, really nicely welded, polished aluminum frames that float around Agnes Martin paintings, for instance, that seem to declare for a while that their work was finished and done, and there was a limit that was like external to the physical painting. That, I mean, I think looks, they're very distasteful in a certain sense right now, and I think I was interested in exploring the way that this very utilitarian object could engage with that in the same way, whereas like aluminum is one hand very DIY in a sense. Like I think of it's just very lightweight and rigid, and it's inexpensive. It's also seems in a way repulsive and really horrible for the earth or something like this, and ubiquitous. And I think it's also it works really well with these larger scale paintings to create something that is it creates a deep space somehow inside of the paintings that have this, this epoxy is almost in the center. These forms here in this work in particular, I mean, are almost a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch deep. So the bars are kind of, they're almost like holding the epoxy, the space, the visual space of that epoxy, like in the painting.
They're kind of pressurizing the space, like you said, like you know, it's like those in like a Gothic novel where the walls are kind of closing in, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much pressure with these bars on the side, but they're also like a very light kind of space age extruded aluminum. So it's an interesting kind of pressure but no pressure type of situation.
And it felt very much at hand in the way that Lewis was picking up before. It was just like, this is what we have. Like, this is
Right.
this is a building material that we have. Like, this is it. Let's use this.
I think in contrast, the webbing, thinking of the works as a series and looking at the titles, which are all Balka and then a parenthetical designation of something, the webbing acts like that kind of bracket or parentheses that is sort of maybe implying that they're all part of some continuum, that this field that the image is placed upon, but then those are telling you this is the thing of this painting.
That's interesting. I never put that together.
It's very interesting to me too, because they're like these unironic air quotes, you know.
yeah.
And you know, you probably hate me even saying that, but
I kind of love that though.
you know, irony gets such a bad name these days, you know, and so misunderstood in a kind of shallow way. But yeah, and the difference with them inside the frame is too, they're not as much as like physical pressurizing, but they do become kind of a figurative quote, like a figurative quote.
I mean, I think that the painting would feel much different without these bars. It would feel a bit almost. It's strange that this very obvious gesture, in a way, of the marks of the adhesion of the banding. I think it saves the paintings from becoming melodramatic. Like, and that's something that's happening in the Balka paintings that don't work, is they feel melodramatic,
Right.
versus the ones that have they get close to being melodramatic and something pulls it away. So maybe that's a good point.
There's that one Hartung image, if we can go to that, Lewis. And, you know, when I was looking at your work in the studio, you know, there's a lot of verticality to it. And I was thinking about Hartung's gesture. And it's an interesting kind of analog, I think, to what we're talking about, because it's a very sincere kind of gesture, you know, expressionist gesture, but it's also like his whole thing, you know, his whole thing was like invested, just like Lucio Fontana, you know, is invested in that kind of slashing gesture. But it's a weird kind of hinge where there's like this really sincere expressionist gesture, but it also operates as its own kind of representation, you know. Yeah. And I think I see something similar in yours. I mean, not in terms of his work, but in terms of how the gesture is a gesture, but also becomes symbolic of that gesture.
I think I love this image so much. Like I'm still kind of I'm pretty bowled over by it. Because of it's not gratuitous in its like action. It's not trying to like to articulate like a I don't. It's like very self-conscious in a way, but in a good way. I think of a limit. Like it's not. I think this feels very traditional in a way that I was talking about earlier, in the best possible way.
Right.
And it feels really direct and honest in a certain way of the house painter kind of action too. But obviously is not rushed. I mean, this takes a lot of deliberation and a lot of consideration, and is a
Right.
very knowledgeable gesture. I think that, and what's interesting to me is that, like, for me, in using the epoxy or something, it feels at once very immediate, but it's very slow. Actually, I have to. It takes I mix it together, it has to dry. I place it. Okay, I glue it. I wait. There's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of consideration, and something that feels like, I think it takes a lot of time and effort to make something that feels effortless. I mean, I think this is a basic paint. This is a basic quality of, I think, painting that I find successful.
Right.
It doesn't feel over labored, I mean,
I was reading something recently about de Kooning, who would be like the incredible avatar of, like, like immediacy, and like his paintings took a really long time too. They took a long time. They're not like as immediate as they look, which is interesting,
Same with Franz Klein.
Right, right.
I wanted to pull up a couple of these blue works. This one is titled Balka Liver, and this one is titled, tell me if I'm pronouncing this right, Balka Jordgrube. I think I might have put a typo in there.
Jordgubbe, which means strawberry in Swedish.
So these are all of the paintings are visceral, but these are more literally visceral in terms of their relationship to the body, I feel like.
Yeah.
And the red color, the iron pigment. And you had an interesting note about the etymology of that word for strawberry, Erik.
Oh yeah, I think it's just such an amazing word. I mean, jordgubbe is like, jord is earth or dirt, and gubbe is like old man. And so I think Swedes think like strawberries look like the nose of an old man, like an old drunk, like a red like a red pussy kind of nose. And it's kind of, I mean, this painting has it didn't end up in the presentation, the physical space in Paris, but it has a bunch of glass beads inside of it. It kind of looks bruised, and it's a kind of, so the beads feel like the ones that have not been absorbed into the acrylic paint, that is almost, I think of like acrylic almost more as like a glue, like and I think of than a paint vehicle. I mean, and when you start thinking about this, I mean, paint and it's just pigment, it's just material in a binder that's adhered to something, in the same way that just adhering the epoxy resin or the band is just, putting something into a binder. I mean, so the acrylic is binding these glass beads that are sprinkled for me into the central form, this purple form, and the beads that get painted look almost biological or kind of repulsive in a slight way of their the moldness or something about it, but the ones that remain translucent and light passing through are really, quite kind of attractive or tantalizing in a way. And I think there is something here, and in the last work you showed, I mean, I ride my bike around the city as like how I get around, and I mean, Joe Fife picked this up in the press release really well. Of like, there's just like a certain materiality of like a squished rat or like squished pigeon. I think has kind of inflected my visual sense that like these kind of feel like that. It's like a flattened and like coated composition that somehow has a lot of chance involved in it, but then I'm saying it's done and I'm quoting it and taking it into my painting in it and insisting that I did it.
We had been talking about fossils or fossilization in your studio, and I think the flattened roadkill is a better way to describe it, because it's not a perfect cross section. It still has that texture, and the form is expanding instead of being cut precisely.
I think the painting seems squished and flattened, and then the sculpture is an interesting kind of segue to that, because they're not really, this magic sculpt, which you might guess by the name, is primarily used as a sculpture material. And I came across it because I was trying to, some of the, like a lot of these paintings have some of them that are not on stretched linen in a way have almost a relief quality to them, or perhaps engaging with that tradition. And I was looking for different paints that I could use to almost backfill or build out the surrounding space around these central objects in order to compromise the read of the central object. Like, you don't see it as an object, you see it more as an image when it is not immediately recognized as on top of something, when it feels in the painted field. So I was using like molding paste and all that stuff. And I was talking with the amazing conservator who I have a relationship with about just learning about materials. And she said, like, everything you're looking for is just like in the other aisle. Like, it's in the sculpture aisle, it's not in the painting aisle. Like, look in the sculpture aisle. Like, I think you'd be really excited about this. And I think a part of just my attitude to materials, like we've been talking about, is like I have absolutely no interest in making molds. I have no interest in measuring resins and things and mixing it together. And I liked that this epoxy resin putty that you could work with, you didn't have to create a mold, like you could actually work additively. And I could use this to begin to encase and create imprints around found objects that it was originally the things that I was cutting off of the surfaces to make them surfaces to add to the paintings. And I had a lot of these things just lying around, and I started gluing them together, and they started to feel like a paint, like different sides as images that you would see inside of the painting that were pulled around in 360 degrees, so you could walk around in a way. They're very kind of these meditative, smaller scale sculptures that you look into and in and around, that are the size of, like, one's chest, my chest, in a way that they're not massive. Like they have a certain they don't overwhelm you physically in this way. So they have a visual, a projective visual aspect to them, as well as like that's happening, I think, in the images in the paintings that I've been talking about. And so I wanted to include a couple of sculptures in this show in Paris to engage with the central images and that are happening in the paintings and complicate it in a way. And this is work that's made with paper mache that I've made, and epoxy resin paste, which is like a like kind of it's like the smooth version of the epoxy resin putty that is almost consistent as Vaseline. And I'm using that to almost like embalm these forms that feel kind of peeled. This one feels peeled in a way to me.
Lewis mentioned in the studio Bruce Conner, like the, you know, the mortification aspect. And I also see maybe aspects of Paul Feck.
I see tech in this one. I think in terms of it's almost mysteriously petrified thing that you don't, that looks familiar, but you don't know what it is.
Right, right.
I would, but and there's I love certain aspects of Connor's work in this way. I think like a bit of the uncanny kind of comes through in that way, but there's no doll's eye, baby doll eyes, I think, will not find their way into these anytime soon. But this one feels almost more these two feel the last one and this one feel very biological in a way to me, or of nature, coming through nature, from nature this way. And then to me this one is just very figurative. I mean, it feels reclined, you know. And that's where this title is an allusion to Matisse's sculptures of like that reclining female form. That what's it? The woman. It's like that has her hand perched behind her head. There's a number of forms of versions of this sculpture.
It's interesting how the geometric forms here almost look like a mold making sprue or something, you know? Looks like a preparation for a mold almost.
I mean, this one needed to come off of the plinth a little bit for me. Like, it's interesting. I mean, someone coming from painting, there were all these problems that I had to think about at first, quote unquote problems or whatever, like the sculpture that I hadn't, you know, painting, you just put it on the, you just put it on the wall, quote unquote. I mean, and there's like with these domestically sized sculptures in a way, I was trying to, I didn't want to, I felt like I had to consider like how they would live in a space. Like I wanted them up, right? Up into your visual space so you could look into them and through them. So I didn't want them on the floor. I mean, they're just too small in a way. And I was having them, I had presented them before in dialogue in a sense on a big table, like a number of these sculptures, which is how I would have them in the studio. And then I tried different iterations of like a legged thing. And after a while, it's just like, there's a reason why there's a plinth. I mean, it's just like, you don't think about it anymore. Like it's actually, It's just there. You don't think about it. And this piece of wood that's underneath the sculpture, it's physically attached to and bonded to the white sculpture. The wood is from it's like a baguette, it's called, or something. It's like something that you would adhere to the gallery floor to put the plinth on top of,
right?
So that when a small child runs through the art fair, he knock the Jeff Koons work off into the floor. So I had gotten a pedestal from the gallery and found this thing underneath the pedestal, and I thought this would be a great base for this reclining sculpture. 100%.
Yeah.
I think we're running pretty short on time, I think, but it would be great to talk about the drawings.
Oh, sure.
Let me find one. Here we go. And you had a great presentation in your studio of a few of them. There's sort of the searching that's more obvious in the drawings, a searching for form, than in the paintings to me, and it results in these like spindly and sharp forms. But Tom, you'd picked up on, you're calling them shards, which I thought was an interesting term. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
I think it was related to like the gesture of Hartung, you know, like this elongated, like this attenuated gesture. And for me, I think I was saying in the studio they related to like nerve endings, like they're neurological to me. They're neurological seismic events. So I don't know how that relates to shard, but maybe these are fragments of an idea for like a finished work. I forgot my original idea of shards.
But I think there's also this conversation about shards and pieces and the sharpness of the edge, where you have the contrast with Balka's mountains, which are found and created within the medium, and then like Friedrich's ice floats that are cracking, that are very sharp and naturalistic, but painted meticulously and predetermined.
And there's something to the attenuation that's style, like there's like in those painters, like in Balka, it's stylized. It's like the Tolkien kind of Yes album cover attenuation of form. And I'm not saying that that's present here, but I mean there's something about that pulled form that is compelling outside of the stylization cliche, and I came upon Hartung when I was looking at these drawings, but I found Erik's gesture quite unique in that regard. Like I went to Nolde right now, like another attenuated kind of stylized form, and even it doesn't look like this, in my search and like the research, I found that Erik's gesture was actually quite unique.
It's almost like the lines are depicting armature of something invisible on the page instead of outline or texture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think in the studio I use the term like like anatomy, or like a flayed man,
Mm-hmm.
Again, like going back to the whole idea of like these lines as nerve endings, an analog of nerve endings it's a network of line that doesn't necessarily, it refers to the figurative without actually referring to the figurative.
It's interesting because I'm just picking up seismic and a lot of like for me, for me, where these drawings came from is like I didn't draw for a very long time when I started making my painting, when I started with engaging with painting, and I think I felt I wasn't sure how the line engaged with the brush in a way. Like, so I was making a lot of some paintings on paper in order to get out of using this found surface, and I'm trying to use like a different muscle in a way. And the way that I was painting and creating linear forms in these paintings on paper was by painting around a shape, and then the white of the paper would come through and create a form. So it was kind of made in reverse in this way. And when I started, I started making drawings inside of small sketchbooks, and often it'd be on the subway, and a lot of times, like I literally needed an edge to start in this way. And also I was embarrassed, like being on the train drawing. Like I just didn't want to be that guy on the train. And like I also like didn't really want folks to think I was drawing them. And I quickly realized no one cares what you're doing. So, but I would still sit there and have my little sketchbook and holding my pen really far back. So like I would kind of be hiding what I'd be doing. And so in that way, like you have the vibration of the subway was working as like a found surface to work up against, and using the gutter between the pages to work up and through and around. So
I
I'm
love
doing
that.
that for a while. Yeah.
That's so
I love
interesting.
that the goal was to capture that vibratory line. And I'm just thinking of that.
I couldn't avoid it. I mean, if you've
Yeah.
ridden the 2 train like between 72nd and 42nd Street.
Well, I'm thinking
Just
of that
had
in
to.
contrast to Ellsworth Kelly would make drawings on a bus in his notebook, and it would just be the way that the shadows from the windows fell across the page, and he would trace the outline. And that resulted in that great painting at the Whitney called Atlantic. But the goal there is totally just to like make that transitory moment flat and graphic, which is the opposite from the same situation that you're putting yourself in.
But it's interesting because like what I was talking about with the painted paper and creating the image out of the verso is actually the same engagement that Kelly was doing on those drawings on the bus with painting the negative space. I mean, he's allowing the shadow to come, shadow becomes positive from the negative. He's painting the shadow, but he's painting nothing in a way. And then says later on, I mean, I think, these are graphite, there's like vine charcoal drawings that are made in the studio, these ones that we're looking at. And a lot of the drawings in the sketchbooks when I'm on the subway are coming not from observation, obviously, but and I have these elements of, I have drawn from nature, observing branches and spaces between natural forms. And then coming into the studio, in a way, there are these drawings that are made from observation of my sculptures. And that's where the form is coming from in these works, combining different views of the sculptures to create this like linear exploration of like one view of the sculpture, like kind of where I'm seeing in that sculpture, which is interesting to me because the armature of these sculptures is usually taken from nature and from the outside world. So it's like kind of coming back to the rhetorical gesture of the Harlequin in a way. It's like I'm drawing nature that I've translated one. It's like a series of translations away from, what it would be the source in a way. And I have, and then these things are becoming very elongated in a sense. So I think that there is a certain engagement with the verticality of them engages with it in a figurative way. I think that elicits empathy in a sense, which that's something Tom and I were talking about at the studio on Saturday.
Thinking about that verticality, I'm in this piece especially, the drips are interesting to me because they seem to be in a different color, a color that was painted over in all other instances except for the drip, perhaps. So those are the only remaining traces of that layer.
Red drips are very hard to pull off.
Yeah. You told me in a previous conversation that a lot of the drips in former works were painted over, so that there are these ghostly imprints, or you spray them with water so that just the edge remains, but it's not an actual drip. And you'd referred to them in that way as being kind of hidden, but also mannered, which I thought was such an interesting word to use. And I wonder if you think of them that way still, or your relationship to that painterly mark is changing or evolving.
I think I'm allowing it to say more drippy in a way. I don't know, which would mean to me so when those drips were drying and I would spray it so that the center would fall away and fall out, you would get the acrylic would dry around the outside. So this is just what you're referring to. So it would kind of almost look like an image of a drip, like a stamp of if you went to the rubber stamp store and asked them to make a drip stamp, like that's what it would look like in a way. I think I think it's a tool and a mark just like any other mark. So I think certain works would call for more of a distance than others in a way. I think that spraying and creating that index, so that obvious index of the drip is it's like it's knob turning. So you're turning the knobs on each painting of how far one has gone in one way, and then how far you want to turn it back the other way, in order to create a space where it's like they're not. I'm thinking of something Tom mentioned really briefly at the end of this, like a mischaracterization of irony in a way. I think it's very interesting in this space. So when I'm thinking of an artist I think is very successful, like Michael Majerus, who would perhaps be someone who comes to mind when I'm thinking about image of a, or I don't know. I mean, like the drip is an image of painting. I don't think of Majerus as an ironic, like he's like not a caricature of irony, like in this way. But I would say that he has a distance from painting that makes the painting interesting and to me, even though he's not, perhaps it wouldn't seem like he is engaging with the same language of abstraction that I am in. I think his engagement between these spheres is very, 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 very successful, and even is not someone I'm thinking about consciously when I'm thinking about these drips. I mean, this is still in my background and my attitude and engagement with painting. So I don't know if I would. I'm leaving things less buttoned up now, I guess is the short answer. So there would be maybe more drips, but it's interesting when you look at this and you say, "Huh, I don't see the green, but there's a green drip there." I didn't try to do that. This was something that I left in though in the end when a painting felt finished. So even on that other Baltke painting that we looked at of mine, the first one with the black background, there are these 4 drips in the bottom of the painting that they don't. It's very. They're red. I mean, it's like really like the water wiping away the black, which is painted around this form, and they're not colors. They're clearly not yellow or purple or green, which is the colors making up the central form. So they slow down the read and the engagement with the painting. So, which I think is something that painting can do very, very successfully. Slowing time down.
And even though a drip you would think should create some downward movement of the whole form of the painting, these seem to be propping up the form and allowing it to be steady in that void that it's sitting in. Void maybe isn't the right word, but the unidentified field.
Well, like the factor of the water dripping corresponding to gravity is just like a very efficient way of making a line too.
I think we probably have a bunch of audience questions at this point, but Tom,
that was an hour and a half. Wow.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts, Tom, or anything we missed before we go to questions?
I don't think we missed anything. But yeah, thank you, Erik. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Louis. for running everything and your excellent questions as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's always fun to talk to you, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you both. This is great. Yeah. Questions?
Thank you all. That was, yes, so fun to listen to as well. I hope you know that. And yeah, it was really great to hear like work through, especially your ideas about what is tradition and what is traditional. And cool to hear you think about like your use of non-traditional material as engaging with tradition. I really appreciated hearing that. Our first question comes from G.E. Schwartz, who unfortunately had to leave early, but I'll be reading on his behalf. And he asks, can you talk a bit about the idea of the center zone as a fictional rather than a found form, which seems so at work in your paintings? Where does that come from? Landscapes?
It's a lot hard to unpack. I wish that the question, the poser of the question was still here. I think so. Where there is something in the paintings where it's like always just right in the center, right? And I think part of that came from it's like a anti-composition strategy in a way. But it's not. I just kind of think in the end it's like that is like that is big, that is you can't really untether that from the entire experience of the painting in a way. Meaning, like, I've been asked a lot of times, like, well, why is it this size versus that size? Like, why do you have so much space around the painting, the center form? Why is it so big? Or why, it's often why is it so big as opposed to why is it so small with the paintings. I mean, I kind of just, I've often felt a bit perplexed by this question because it's just like, well, your whole experience of the painting would be completely different if it were any different. It's like asking, it's like, why is your SUV not a convertible? Like, what do you mean? Like, why can't it convert? Or like, I don't understand. It's just like, that's because that's how it is. What do you, so the space around the form is a choice. It's a mark, even if it's not seemingly enacted upon. I think for me, like, I liked at first the idea of it was showing that I was choosing this and not that. And I felt also that by it does feel like even though I'm saying like an anti-composition strategy or something, which we think of it more referring to like kind of a modernist project or something like this, I think that the centralized form relates to more of that larger, bigger T tradition thing that we were talking about in a way that feels more expansive. So for me, it's just like icon paintings. You always had like kind of this idea of like this is the important thing is here happening in the center, and there's a choice there in this way, and in a visual space that it's engaging with. I don't think I'm like saying like, oh, I'm going to try to make these are not crucifixions or something, but I mean it's like very interesting to think. I think of like Fontana and his central the strips, and then you have the sculptures like here are these crucifixions. It's just like it's a very interesting sort of unpacking of like a kind of Western visual psychology in space in a way that is very latent, perhaps here, and I guess the result of looking at art,
Thank you, Erik. I think that was an excellent answer for not having the question asker here. So thank you. Our next question will be coming from our very own Malvika.
Thank you, Anya. And thank you, Erik. Thank you, Louis. Tom, this has been fantastic. I feel like this is the conversation It's just been a pleasure. As a non-painter, listening to people talk about kind of formal elements of painting feels very akin to like dream analysis or like dream revelation, like a little psychedelic. You know, things land and connections are formed, and it feels very metaphorical. So I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed hearing you speak about kind of like anchoring images and texts of existent paintings into the world you're building, and it made me think. It felt very much very image of an image. I liked that kind of painted wallpaper quality. It felt very much like a heterotopia, kind of like the way people have theorized a mirror or a carpet, like a non-space space. Um, and like just hearing you talk about the stamp of a drip, just being just very cool. Um, and I guess like when we were talking about, I love the question of place and genre. That funny moment where you were like, oh, a painting of Iceland can look like high melodrama. That can be the genre, but actually that is the literal monumentalism of what it actually feels like and looks like to be in Iceland. And I guess that kind of got me thinking about like how you're clearly a very interesting thinker, and I was wondering how you relate to genre, perhaps like outside of art. Um, a lot of your paintings to me, felt very resonant with like kind of clever conceptual gambits of like a Borges story, or like things that the Worcester group would put on, or kind of that terrain. And I was curious about kind of, yeah, how you think about genre for yourself. And then a little curious about your reading practice or like other media you consume, how you think about television, film. I guess my question is like, how do you think about genre? And right now, are you reading or engaging things that you might call like escapist literature? And like, what might that be for you, and how do you relate to those things?
Well,
I know it's a
you
big
know,
gambit. It's like a big, big
yeah,
question,
no,
but yeah.
we'll break it up. It's good. I mean, I think you go and get a haircut, and you have to talk to you get to talk to the person cutting your hair, and oh, what do you do? I'm an artist. And then they say, oh, what kind of art? And then I say painting. And then they're like, oh, like what kind? And then this is where you're getting, it seems to me, it's like I say abstract painting, and it seems like bullshit to me, or like a lie in a way. Like I know, like I'm cutting my losses in a way of trying to find a shortcut to some image that the person cutting my hair, who I don't know what their background is in art, or relationship to would understand more of the space that I'm engaging in. I do not think of my paintings as abstracts, really. I don't. I think they exist in the world. I could, you know, I wouldn't really want this to fall on my foot. I mean, I'm just saying, like, but they're not paint, because I think we've unpacked a lot of the ways that these paintings could, I think, relate to experience of the body, experience of place, and so I don't. What does this mean to say that they're abstract? I mean, it's a really big question to unpack. But I mean, I will go back. I will say I make abstract paintings just as a shortcut, because I'm not making self. I'm not paint. I'm not painting. I guess this is the visual language and the history that I'm more engaged with. And now I do love a lot of figurative painting. Most of it is not made by people painting today, but when I go to the museum, like I'm mostly looking at older stuff. I love going to the Frick. I love getting lost in the Met. Like, and that's like mostly what I'm engaging with. I like looking at ceramics. Last time I went to the Met, there's all this imperial Chinese ceramics around the rotunda, the Great Hall. It's like just mind blowing to me, the colors and the form. It's amazing. So then when you're getting your haircut, then it's funny. Then the next question is oils, acrylics. it's like, but like it's been like this my whole life. It's like the same, and then mix of things, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of interesting that it goes from like just straight to a popularized understanding of material. And I am engaged with material. It's like material research in a way that I'm that's helping propel my work and keep it interesting for me here. And so like what else keeps it interesting for me is like the question of influence. So like I'll read you can read a poem and it makes perfect sense to you, but you don't know, I can't tell you what it means in this way. But I would say I've been in the same way of a lot of the philosophy that I've been reading. I wouldn't say like I'm trying to illustrate any sort of concepts, like, but I would be, a lot of the work was I really was blown away with like reading a lot of Simone Weil stuff about 10 years ago. It's like really important to forming a lot of my thinking. I mean, I get most of what I'm reading these days. I really like reading biography. I really like reading artist biographies because it, especially recently, like I felt I had a lot of trouble focusing the past 2 years, and it felt like this narrative was something I could hold on to, even if it was like a very pulpy, dramatic biography about Caravaggio. Like it held my attention, and it was very. I think reading stories is a great way to learn about the world, and these, and for me too, just kind of learn about what's going on with myself in a way. Like I'm here living in the moment. This is unfolding as it's going on. So perhaps like I like reading other people's analysis of other artists going through certain processes or changes or something of the story. And I think it's just a more lively way of learning or reflecting upon anecdotes in a way. I think like anecdotes have been more useful for me in the studio in a sense than theory in a way. At this moment, I'm not like anti-theory or something, but I think there's a great place for everything. But I mean, when painters or somebody are talking about certain things, it's like, well, it's no one wants to tell anyone what to do, right? So it's just like, well, like Picasso had this problem, and he did this, like kind of thing. And I feel like that's part of where I'm exploring now for me. Yeah. And I mean, I think I've been recently I've been really inspired. I really like Pasolini's poems have been a revelation for me. Like I didn't know Pasolini wrote poems. I think the way I mean, in his films, like the use of these narratives, like the Cameron or the Arabian Nights, like these are just like very contemporary stories and movies. Like in a way, I relate to them very, very as if they're happening in my life in a way, even though these are kind of these grand stories. I think of that a lot as a way of this tradition in a sense. I like there's like something erotic about the poems that I think of as very interesting to like an eros of objects and space, and not even if there are ones that are a bit more frank of sex. I mean, they're erotic in terms of like an attraction to tangible material and a pleasure in that, which I'm very interested in. Yeah, I mean, but honestly, I'm just like usually walking by Strand and like on the Upper West Side, and there's like the carts outside, and that's what I look, and that's where I buy a book from the carts, or I get it from the laundry room, the free books. Like those are the best books.
I love that. That's also very like pragmatic, and like there's a materialism to the way you're operating in the world, that's where your library is coming from. It's either the Strand or the laundry room.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. You gave us so many gems to work with. We'll be reading for a little while. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malvika, for that question, and thank you, Eric. And our final question will be coming from Fong Bui, our publisher. Here it comes.
Eric.
Hey, Fong.
Hi, Tom. I'm sorry I was on so many meetings, so I didn't hear the whole thing, but I heard glimpses here and there from my third ear. But I could only imagine that the relationship between your painting to your sculpture as autonomous objects. I couldn't help but think the same way because I heard Tom mention the Brock. He also makes sculpture as an autonomous, discrete object. The same way that we can think of Twombly's sculpture to his paintings. So as far as form being concerned as a plastic form, I think that your concern or your attraction to French painting, especially Tassism, Wolves particularly, or anyone of of that ethos, try to eliminate geometric paintings, so to speak, or any kind of geometric sculpture, but prefer the intuitive way of creating form. And you and I once talking about Robert Motherwell, briefly, particularly the period when he was making collage, way before the landmark elegy, the Spanish elegy, where a lot of collision of form and the tactility of form, the tone form, the cut form, and whatnot, seem to be a little bit sharing some kind of French taste or French post-war, I would say, movement, a couple of them, but we talk about lyricism in a way that is not academic. The lyricism that are accidentally occur when you allow the material dictate the form being made. So how can you describe, or what can you describe, Eric, that the attraction is so deep? And it's unusual because a lot of younger or your generation, among the painters we know, don't share that affinity at all.
I mean, that's where I was interested in showing these works in Paris, because I wanted to see how the French people would respond to them, because oftentimes the reference does not come, the conversation in New York does not go to Talcoat when you see something stuck centrally on a painting. And Tom and I were kind of talking about this a little bit, like how perhaps, you could unpack this central form here in terms of Rauschenberg or or John's, in a sense. I was very interested to see if this Joe Fife left the talk, but Joe, the idea of tradition that I'm talking about can also be summed up in this experience of the tableau in the painting, which Joe has explored a lot in his work and in shows that he's done. And for me, I also came from a background of looking at a lot of Tassism and being like, that is bad. Like, that's just bad art. Like that is bad taste. Like, that is not how you paint.
Yeah.
Even Hartung, in a way, was like very, I would think of as spectacularized or something, in a way. Like it was not tasteful. And I had to take a little bit of time to sort of scrub away what that obscurity on my glasses looking at it, and had to look at it new a bit, because it's just this like reserve of really wonderful work that has often been so in the case of like Nicolas de Stael, like overdone by IKEA or something, and also fakes and forges and copies. So we've just been oversaturated with it. And it's very hard to see the original spark of what could feel exciting in the work. And a lot of it's just it's not been really readily available here for us to see. We've always seen support surface work as a diminished and less successful version of American minimalism or post-minimalist sculpture. And I think we're starting to revisit that assumption a bit more. I find it very interesting in terms of branding is that there's certain French artists who found a trope in a language, and then they just stuck with it. And they do it over and over and over again and work with it. And that can be very expansive for some artists. And some of them just change their style every 6 months or a year. Like I'm thinking of Pierre Baraglio, who's a fantastic painter, really underrated artist. You know, what is it about Motherwell? I mean, I think about this too, in terms of craft. I don't want to say craft because there's a lot of different assumptions about it, but you know, Motherwell I think is a very interesting artist because from what I understand is that he had an attitude that history would separate the successful works that he made from the less successful ones, and he was not going to take an authoritative position on this. It's just, I'm going to make stuff and I'm going to let the world decide the world will decide for me in a way what was successful or not. And I think sometimes in Motherwell's work, there's a craftsmanship of risk in it in a way, and there's also something that can also feel very stylized in it that can be detracting from his work too, that I see in a lot of the French work too, where it can seem rather stylized. I'm not excited about Georges Mathieu's career being resurrected by the Gallery Industrial Complex these days. That's a far cry from the sensitivity and the materiality of Tal Coates. So, I mean, within that, there's I've just discovered this through certain affinities with younger French artists, where they would see, oh, this reminds me of these artists. And I said, I have no idea who you're talking about. Like, I need to go look this up. And the French artists were not excited about this association, honestly. I mean, they've seen enough of it in a way. They don't need to see any more of it. And I mean, but perhaps there's still, I think, more of I guess at least anecdotally to me, like what I'm so excited about and seeing in a lot of Brock's work is that it is so incredibly intelligent in its presentation. You look at these paintings and they have knowledge in their image and the lyricism inside of them, especially the late works. Like I still feel that maybe here culturally we have a bit of a distrust of images. I mean, and this is just my hypothesis in a way. I still think we have a tremendous affinity to the written word and through authority, to theory in a way, and not poetry. We distrust poetry, I think, as a society, and I'm not trying to project France as some sort of utopia. I mean, I think, but perhaps there is less of a cultural sensation of that distrust on there. I mean, a certain comfortability with ambiguity in a way, where I know for me in my work, that held me off from exploring this language that I'm exploring. I learned in school, I felt that I had to determine and understand my attitude towards representation or something, or abstraction, and what my position was. And before I even arrived at it at myself. And I think that really hindered me in my development of my work. I think it helped put a language to things so that when I had arrived there, I was able to put words to it, which is wonderful. I love writing about my work. But I write about my work as if I'm in how I learned to teach with like studio in a school to kids, like, which is not to diminish children. It's about making complex ideas clear. You're not making them less complex. And I think oftentimes here in the States, when we learn about painting and our approach to things, we're putting the cart before the horse. Our feet have arrived before the painting has arrived. And I hope to see, I see some shifting in that in the French painting in a way. And I think that's why a lot of French painters were very excited about Motherwell and Motherwell's work.
Well, I mean, Motherwell was being marginalized partly because he was the spokesman for the New York school. He's the only Harvard-educated philosophy and spoke eloquent French and other languages, and he's the one who brought surrealist poetry to this country, Dada works and whatnot. He's not associated in a greater depth among the community, the downtown people like the Kunin or Pollock who were bohemian. So I think they resented him because he was also wealthy and educated and whatnot. But I think there'll be a place for Motherwell to be reconsidered. I think the timing is here. But as far as French painting is concerned, Dadaism to me to abstract expressionism, either way that the French plays, jazz, or rock and roll. It's not quite the same as the American do. But I have another quick follow-up too. You were talking about trapping the space. Tom, and this also to you too, Louis, is that the trapping concept, the space in between, which now, to me, so much a centralized image, the way you treat images as being the center and hovering very sensitive throughout that given space. It's quite similar to the way that Ron Warchoff had deployed his images to be the middle, and the way that he flirted deeply with what is considered to be three-dimensional and what is two-dimensional. That two reality is always colliding or etching each other through a strand of hair. And I think trapping space is a very important element in your work, and I'm just happy to hear more and more. I feel like this is an Erik Lindman seminar. More to come. So thank you, Erik.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you, Fun.
Thank you, Tom. And back to you. Is it Anya doing the MC today?
Yes, yeah.
Back to you, Anya. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fong, for those excellent questions and comments. And thank you, Erik, for sharing with us. And thank you, Tom and Louis, for your presentation and your questions. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of today, Elizabeth Lothian, to the stage. Writer Elizabeth Lothian is the social media manager at the Brooklyn Rail and an assistant editor at Guernica. Her work has appeared in Book Forum, LitHub, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from the New School, where she was a creative writing fellow. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Elizabeth, to close this out.
Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you, Erik, for joining us. I had the pleasure of editing your weekend journal back in the spring, where you talked about some of the works that are in this show. So it was cool to hear you expand on that. And thank you, as always, Tom, and my comrade at the Rail, Louis, for a lovely afternoon conversation. Today, I'm going to be reading a poem by the late, great Mary Oliver. It's from her 2004 collection, Why I Wake Early. And the title of the poem is Mindful. Every day I see or I hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It is what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over in joy and acclamation. Nor am I talking about the exceptional, the fearful, the dreadful, the very extravagant, but of the ordinary, the common, the very drab, the daily presentations. Oh, good scholar, I say to myself, how can you help but grow wise with such teachings as these? the untrimmable light of the world, the ocean shine, the prayers that are made out of grass.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It was an excellent selection. And thank you again, Erik, Lewis, and Tom for this conversation today. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation between Allison Elizabeth Taylor and Jason Rosenfeld. And I'm going to now allow everyone to unmute to say thank you and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Elizabeth and Lewis and Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that poem.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, Elizabeth.
Erik.
Thank you, Erik. Fantastic.
Thanks all.
Great
Thank you so
I'm
much.
just going through all the comments now.
We
Kind of
got it.
fun. Wow.
Yeah, we can make sure those get saved.
Oh, please, yeah.
Things we
Yeah, we can email them to you.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. So you don't have to speed read right now.
Congratulations, Erik.
Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic.
This was really
Thank
exciting.
you.
Thank you
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.